Well, in this second talk, what I'm going to do is try to unpack a little bit more deeply what is soul. What is some of the psychological, what are some of the insights we can gather about what is soul? What is this challenge of James Hillman? I think he's very right in what he has to say. I think his understanding of Christianity is pretty shallow, and so his scholarship, and he blames it on one council of the church, and anyhow, he just doesn't understand it very well. But he's such a genius because I think he's basically right, the way he sees the development of Western thought particularly. One of the groups of people that I think really give us examples of soulfulness and point to soul are poets. And last year when I gave the retreat to the Jungians in California, I used for the cover of my handout, I forget a picture, and a quotation from Mary Oliver, the poet, who I think is one of the greatest poets nowadays, and the quotation was, "My job is to love the world," which I think is a great quotation. My job is to love the world. Well, about the fourth day of the retreat, I was walking down a hallway, and at the end of the hallway there was a door with a couch and a refrigerator over here where people could get a little food for breaks and so forth. And I'm walking down and I see a woman sitting there. Who was it but Mary Oliver?
Oh my goodness.
And so talk about one of Jung's great concepts of synchronicity, and here was the synchronicity of, my theme sort of was Mary Oliver, and there was Mary Oliver seated. And I had been told that she occasionally showed up at that retreat house, but that she did not want to be, contacted by people. She was there just on retreat and rest and so forth. So I didn't talk to her, but I grabbed the door and I turned around and I gave her the hugest smile. So, and she smiled, so that was a nice exchange. Okay. John Wilcox told me during the break that of a book by Paul Elie called, what is it, John?
The Life You Save May Be Your Own.
The Life You Save May Be Your Own, and it's about Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day and Walker Percy
And Flannery O'Connor.
And it's about their spiritual journeys. And all soulful people, all people of great depth and inwardness and richness of humanity and spiritual insight, and giants of our time and age. And that's a book you might want to read sometime about these great people. I think well-written biographies tell us about soul and the growth of soul, the conflicts, the struggles, the blessings, and we have that. I talked about the soul being a vessel. In Jeremiah, we have that image of God being the potter who shapes the clay pot of our lives, the vessel, and that's an image that's taken up by St. Paul too. Okay, so the more we grow in soulfulness, ironically it means empty in a sense, wide, and able to incorporate more inclusive, deeper, wider, okay? So if you turn in your handout to page, I think it's 3, on the second page there's that quotation, "The dynamics of soul and spirit incessantly interweave," Robert Hass, a poet at Berkeley. But the third page starts with some questions. What is soul? And who points us to the contemporary rediscovery of soul? How can soul be distinguished from spirit? Has soul been lost or eclipsed in the Western tradition? And I think it has. And I think that Hillman really puts his finger on it. That's not an easy article to read, by the way, but I think it's very important. How do we evoke and educate the soul? At the beginning, the first page here, where it shows that fountain, there's a quotation from The Contemplative Mind in Society, which John and I were talking about. They're very much interested in bringing soul into the academic realm. And it's basically a secular organization open to any religious path that teaches meditation in the academic world. And notice the quotation here, contemplative practice is an effective way, in my experience, the only effective way to bring about this integration and healing of the self and to establish a realistic basis for healthy relationships, sane, creative institutions, and a just, sustainable world. Robert Shapiro, Board of Directors, New York Stock Exchange. You wouldn't expect that from somebody from the stock exchange, right? Okay. But, here he is on the Board of Directors of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. I tell people that the movement towards meditation and centering and so forth is growing so much in our country, the Contemplative Mind and Society, John Mayne's approach to meditation, centering prayer, Thomas Keating, and so forth. There's a Protestant parish in Binghamton sponsoring a Trappist monk who's a Zen master soon. That's interesting, isn't it? That's interesting. I'll try to find out. I think it's Kevin Hunt from Spencer. And he's going to be speaking in Binghamton. Probably Art Suggs parish, but I'm not sure. Okay. At any rate, the fountain is a very important symbol because when the vessel is filled, it overflows. Okay. And so the Spirit is what fills us and transforms us and energizes us and invites us to grow and makes us creative and makes us healing people, And so, in a sense, the two basic images for the day is the vessel, which is our soul, and the fountain, which is the Spirit-filled person. Okay, the vessel and the fountain. My favorite quotation from Scripture is John 7:37. On the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus stood there and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let that person come to me, and from that person's center will flow a fountain of living water." So, if anyone thirsts, let that person come to me, and from that person's center will flow a fountain of living water.
That was John.
7:37, so that if our heart is open, the vessel of our being is receptive, if we accept the grace and healing of Christ, if we're transformed, we're Spirit-filled, then we become a fountain. Okay? We become able and capable of light and energy and healing and, prophetic action perhaps. Maybe not just nice people, but, raving maniacs of, let's change things, prophets, okay? Dorothy Day could be like that. She could afflict the comfortable. She could really, there she stands, and nobody could push her out of the way because it's what she believed in. I could tell you a story about one time she didn't like what the Cardinal of New York was doing, and so she set up folding chairs in front of the chancery and just sat there and prayed until he changed his mind. It was he had gone against the Union, who were digging graves in the Catholic cemeteries, and he was using scabs, to go and dig the graves. And of course, Catholic social thought is very much on the side of unions. And she said, "That's wrong, so we're going to change it." She changed his mind. I have to tell you a little story. We had a chaplain a number of years ago, Monsignor Cox, from the New York Archdiocese, who has a farm near Bainbridge. And he was a seminarian when that happened, and so they had no choice. They were ordered to go out to the cemeteries to dig the graves. And they took a break and they were having lunch, and the Cardinal ordered in box lunches for the seminarians to eat. And he began to notice that Father Cox, or Jimmy Cox's box lunch was so much better than everybody else's. So he turned it upside down and it said Cardinal Spellman on it. He got the Cardinal's lunch. Well, anyhow, this is the kind of, to be a Spirit-filled person means to be not just gentle and meek, but that's, frequently the case, but also maybe fiery, and filled with the Spirit, just full of conviction and passion and so forth. Okay. All right. So, over over on page 3 again. What is the inner relationship of psychology, psyche, and spirituality? You know, and I might say this, is that in the early years of psychology, when it was growing as a profession, psychologists, Freud did not have a very good view of religion, as you remember. You know, religion was a kind of neurosis. It was kind of a crutch that people used to manage life, and Freud just did not believe, you know, Moses and monotheism's work. And at any rate, there's been historically a kind of animosity between psychology and religion. Religion has opened up a lot to using psychological insight, you know, especially kinds of Jungian and transpersonal insight and so forth. So there's a better relationship now than there has been in the past. But, you know, the standard practice of therapy and psychiatry and so forth, you do not talk to a patient about your particular beliefs, you know. It's just an objective, you know, if they want to talk about their beliefs and so forth, okay, but a therapist remains neutral. Okay. Has modernity in the West been characterized by a body-spirit dichotomy or a body-soul dichotomy? What is the origin of this? All right. Well, we inherited, you know, from St. Paul and the New Testament, this division of body, mind, and spirit. It really should be, in Greek, sarx, psyche, and pneuma. Sarx, psyche, and pneuma. Or soma, psyche, pneuma. Okay. See, the Greeks had a way of distinguishing between the psyche and the pneuma. In English, we don't. For example, in the Magnificat, we say, my soul magnifies the Lord, my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. They're kind of interchangeable. That's Hebrew parallelism. And so sometimes we use the word soul, sometimes we use the word spirit. It's interchangeable. But in Greek and Latin, there's a very distinct way of talking about the difference. So in Latin, it would be corpus, anima, animus, okay? And then spiritus, okay? So the last time that I know of any consistent group that used the word anima for soul was in the 12th century. And then it began to change, okay, because there was greater movement towards vernacular languages and so forth. So in the next comment I make here, and this may be a bit challenging, mind may be a poor translation for psyche, because what do we think of as mind? As intellectual, rational? That's certainly not the whole of psyche. It's maybe what they call higher soul. You know, it's one dimension of soul, but it's not the whole story. It's not the emotional. It's not, you know, what Jung would call the archetypal and so forth. It would be better to say heart in the biblical sense, as in Leb Shomea, the listening heart. In 2 Kings chapter 3, when Solomon became king of Israel, he felt very inadequate. You know, this, I'm suddenly king? And so he prays for wisdom. Wonderful, wonderful prayer. And he says, give me, O Lord, a listening heart, that I might discern, that I might know what to do. Give me, O Lord, a listening heart, the Leb Shemea. That's the soul, that's the heart, okay? It's not, it's much more than mind, you know. It's both heart and mind together. In fact, only one language I can think of right now combines both, and that's Chinese. HSIH, I don't know how you pronounce it in Chinese, is heart-mind. And that's how it's translated in English, heart-mind. We in English think the mind is up here, right? And the heart is here. The leb for the Semitic people was here. It's the hara of the Far East, okay? So Psyche is more like heart. You know, for example, in that passage I quoted from Philippians, fill your minds with all that is true and beautiful and noble and worthy of praise. When they translate it mind, it doesn't say it the way it should be. It should be fill your hearts, fill your soul, you know, nourish yourself with the true, the good, the beautiful. This expands the heart. mind isn't, it's not concepts and it's not intellectual reasoning, it's much more than that, okay? One person I had on retreat one time said, well, do you think it's sort of like hardware, software, and electricity using computer language? And I don't know. What do you think, Sean? Do you think the body is hardware and the mind is
That's
psyche?
one way of looking at it, but it's very
It's kind of
insightful.
crude. It's a bit crude, isn't it?
I think the Eastern way of looking at it through manas being the mind, but the sort of the IBM machine in the brain, and then buddhi, the
Deeper mind.
that distinguishes the
Uh-huh.
discriminator, so to speak, and then the chitta, which is more the heart, really.
Yes, spiritual.
Is and then you have a trinity there, and I think that's a more helpful way of looking at it than the
Right,
traditional way of Western
right,
geography.
right.
And so I think the idea of the subconscious and the unconscious and the superconscious and all these kind of things, I think get resolved in that hierarchy of the Vedantic way
Right.
of looking.
Yeah, the Eastern, the Indian view of the person, there's 20, isn't there 26 elements or something?
Well, 27, depending on, I mean, it's 3, it's 9, it's 7, 27, depending on how you multiply them.
Right,
But it's more subtle in some way,
right,
and then it presents a view from the top. That is, we look at the universe as and then we say, well, this is the senses tell us this and that and that. Whereas their view is that the elements, water, air, earth, and company, is the result of the senses. They are the senses first, and then they are the elements, which make great sense. Because what you see is really seen through a screen of language and physical situation and all that kind of stuff. And so I find that way of looking at it more helpful. But there is something which is also interesting, is the idea of the pneuma here, which is really the air, the breathing element.
The breath.
And
that's what spiritist means.
that's right. And then you have, and then the great concept of the East is the Atman. And the Atman means really the breather. And then you have the atmosphere. And so we are always in the atmosphere, so we are always in the breather, we are always in the great spirit. And this is what St. Paul says when we are, we live, what's the expression that he uses, the spirit in which we live.
Live and move and have our being.
That's right,
and
that's right, that's the one, yes. But anyway.
Right. I'll possibly return to the question of Atman in my third talk. Let me just say that, when early Christianity took up the question of Psyche, in distinction from spirit or pneuma, they said, well, the soul is, there's the higher soul, and I'm not saying that they were right, this is where I think they got off. They said the higher soul is the rational soul. They were influenced by Greek philosophy. And so the whole purpose of the higher soul, the mind, is to control the lower soul, which is irrational, emotional, passionate, and, would you be surprised, feminine. And so the rational is the masculine part of, this is anima in the lowest possible sense, and this is animus as part of psyche, and this is a masculine word and this is feminine. So you find one 12th century Cistercian writer saying, refuse to discover your soul as anima. Discover your soul as animus, spiritus. You know, putting down the rational, the irrational, the emotional, the affective, you know. This is disorder. This is where problems start, you know. And so it's a less than positive view of human nature, okay? It's, it's very paternalistic and judgmental, okay?
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
How would this connect with the way people are talking nowadays about right brain versus left brain?
Mm-hmm.
Because when you first put that on the board, rational, that's what people are now calling left brain, and emotional, intuitive is right brain. I mean, that seems to me a much less gender-specific kind of way of talking about it, and I was wondering if it really corresponds to your categories.
Somewhat, because, actually, women tend to be more right-brained, more intuitive. Jean Houston, the mind researcher, says women are more intuitive and have a more global consciousness. Men have to go into the workday world, and this, maybe not so much true anymore, and they have to be managers and scientists, and, they're trained to use their left brain. Women are much more artistic, given to forms of creativity that are different than that, okay? Jean Houston says it's because women, especially in the older days when they were at homemakers, they have to be multitasking, instead of focused, they have to be multitasking. What's this kid doing, that kid doing, I have a friend in Texas, one of our oblates, who raised 5 or 6 children and is very, very intuitive, very poetic and so forth. And she says, Sister Donald, I don't even have a left brain.
But those of us who went through a more academic system were trained to ignore our right brains and just develop our left brains.
Oh yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, that's why poetry for me is just a way to feed my soul, because, I love research, and, I can sit down and read a book of philosophy, and that's relaxing. But I also need things for the right brain, and I'm finding, I did a little workshop in California. When I gave a workshop in California, part of it was that a sister came in and did a mandala workshop, and what it was they had a big room like this, and she had saved over a year pages from magazines and advertisements, images, nothing but images, many of them very colorful. And then they gave us a little talk about what you were supposed to do, and you could go out and just pick out from these tables of images things you liked, use a scissors, paste, and make your own mandala. I had a wonderful time. That was just, I noticed that everybody in the room was humming, quietly. You just sensed it was like people really into it and quiet, and just, it was so centered, it was a wonderful experience, like a good liturgy might be, And so, I thought when I retire, I might try some painting, because it's just so different from what I've had to do. But it's the kind of thing that's inviting me. My right brain is inviting me, So, so it is somewhat true that right brain and left, but what brain researchers are finding out now, that it's the correlation of right and left brain which brings psychological integration, so that even scientists, some of them are extremely intuitive. Some of the great scientists, the guy who found DNA, for example, he worked in a lab and he couldn't find the answer, and then he went out for a walk in the park one day, and the double helix symbol came to him, boom, and he had his answer. I know a doctor in Binghamton, excellent diagnostician, and he says when he's up against a question he can't solve, he asks his Psyche to give him an answer in his sleep, and he says more than often he gets some insight. So it's learning to coordinate both left and right brain. You know, Teresa of Avila to me was much more left brain than John of the Cross. He was a poet, and passionate poet. He was more right brain. She was more left brain. She reformed monasteries. She was a manager and so forth. It's very interesting. So it's not necessarily just biological alignment, So, John?
Sister, when did they start making this distinction? You talked about the psyche being divided up
Yeah, that's how
Was
some of
that-
the church fathers,
in the early church.
In the early church, yeah. And they really felt that it was the passionate part of the soul, the emotions, the unruly feminine within that need to be tamed and so forth. I mean, you can find horrendous passages in the fathers of the church, that are projecting this image of the feminine on what they consider to be the lower psyche. And, the whole key is not to root out the passions and the emotions, but to transform them. Okay, so in Western Catholicism, since the 17th, 18th century, our spirituality down to Vatican II was heavily Jansenistic. Very bad view of human nature. Typical Jansenist phrase was root out the passions. Protestant Puritanism was sort of a comparable system, down on human nature, And then this is what James Hillman says in the essay Peaks and Valleys, is that what Christianity teaches is an up-away transcendence. Absolutely not true. And that was his view, It's not about up-away, it's about transforming. The incarnation is about the entrance of God into matter, and so that it's transfiguration. It's not canceling our human nature, it's about transforming. So that it's a very important insight and difference. Okay. Okay, the next quotation here. The medieval world, heavily influenced by classical philosophy, distinguished between higher soul and lower soul. Stoicism, for example, talked about reason or mind guiding and controlling the lower soul. Lower soul was the arena of emotions and the passions, and it was considered feminine. Higher mind was considered masculine and rational. The late medieval Latin Catholic world would distinguish between mind, mens, the rational mind. This is a little bit like Hinduism's distinction, and intellectus, the higher mind. So, for example, I was reading St. Teresa of Avila one day, and she said, one day I began to discover that the mind is not the intellect. That's what the English said, and I said, what? The mind is not the intellect? I went over to the library and looked up the Latin. The mens is not the intellectus. The medieval world had a deeper sense of higher mind, spiritual mind. For those of you into theology, it's the nous in the Greek world, okay? So the higher mind, intellectual, is clearly a spiritual faculty, not just ordinary rationality. This is clear in Aquinas, Bonaventure, and Meister Eckhart. The Christianese would use the word nous to talk about that higher part of the soul. This is exceedingly important. The translator of John Scotta's Erigena in the Paulus Spiritual Classic series calls the nous the interior depth of the person, the interior depth of the person. It could be the difference between the ahamkara and the atman.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, symptoms of soul loss. To go, Hillman says we've lost a sense of soul, and people don't know how to foster their soul, and they don't have the wisdom to contact their interior depths and so forth. So this is what's happening. And see if this description, which is an empirical description of a lot of the problems in our society, isn't true. Psychic numbing, and I think that's true. I notice on the internet, I check the internet news in the morning, and they have these little kind of things that you can click on to get I notice how often it's about shootings, how often it's about the torture of animals, it's about domestic violence, you know. It's almost as if our society or certain factors in contemporary society are deliberately trying to numb the soul, to make us insensitive to human suffering and animal suffering and so forth. So, soul loss, that's a term, by the way, that comes from anthropology. Some of the tribal societies talk about people losing their soul. Obviously, we don't believe ontologically that people lose their soul, but they lose their psyches, they lose their connection. So Jung talks about being in Africa one time, and he's on a long trek, a 20-mile trek, and he's almost to the goal. He can see where he's headed, and all the men carrying the big burdens of, you know, luggage and so forth, put them down. And he said, "Aren't we going on? We're almost there. What are we stopping for?" And the translator said, "They feel they need time for their souls to catch up with them." Isn't that interesting? These natives feel that their souls need to catch up with them. So they were just going to rest for a bit and get their souls reconnected, and then they were going to go on. And that's kind of an image for where we sometimes end up in our spiritual journeys. We trudge through life and we're pressured, and you know we've put out so much that we need to stop and let our souls catch up. I'm talking figuratively and metaphorically. All right, another symptom of soul loss: brokenness, woundedness, addiction, self-hatred, living from distraction to distraction, cynicism, alienation, apathy, burnout, torpor, anxiety. Well, that just about covers everything I'm talking about. But you know, you see it all around in our society.
Would acedia fit in
Acedia,
Catherine
right.
Norris's?
Well, look at the next quote here. The whole of Kathleen Norris's new book, titled Acedia and Me, can be read as a struggle with a variety of soul loss. Whether acedia is a spiritual malady or a psychological problem needs to be discerned, and it could well be both. See reference to her book below in my bibliography. Exactly. Acedia is the old monastic term for fatigue. You know, you've been trying in the spiritual life, and all of a sudden you just have a sense of nothing makes sense, and you know, you're just bored. Boredom is one way to talk about it. And Kathleen Norris wrote this book called Acedia and Me. I gave it to a friend of mine in California who has an ongoing struggle with depression and so forth, and she says, "Well, that book really nailed me." And, you know, there's something to it, you know. I have people come for spiritual direction, people I know who have serious spiritual lives, and, you know, they're praying, and they say, "Well, I don't know what's wrong, you know, I don't know what I should do, I need something." And I say, "Don't do anything. Don't try harder. Whatever you do, don't try harder. Rest. Put the burden down, you know, like those native bearers. Put the burden down. Let your soul do something to widen your heart, you know. See a good movie, not just any movie, but a really good soul-stretching movie. Read a good novel. Listen to music. If I get off-center, what will frequently put me on center is really good music, you know, classical music, sacred music, maybe reading some poetry, taking a walk in nature. I have a kind of secret hideaway over the hills here in the summer. About 3 times I jump in the car. There's a beautiful valley over this direction in Windsor, and it's not settled very much, but I park the car there. I just stay for about a half hour and 45 minutes. I have my solitude, no phones to get to me. I just breathe in that beauty of that valley, you know. So we need to sometimes widen the vessel of the heart in order to receive more spirit. If we live our spiritual life as, you know, a charge up Mount Carmel, try harder, ain't gonna work. You know, I'm ultimately a Taoist spiritually, and that is, you know, by not doing, all gets done. That's what the Taoist hermits felt. By not doing, all gets done. You know, don't try harder. Try harder is Jansenism. The quietist work. Don't try. Okay. there's a wonderful example of that I frequently point to in retreats that I give and so forth. I heard a story on National Public Radio about a Navajo Indian who was in the Vietnam War, and he came back after a terrible experience in Vietnam, shattered, and he was psychologically shattered. He was alcoholic. He had been in various veterans recovery places and had gone through much therapy and so forth. He still wasn't healed. And so the tribe went to the Veterans Association and said, let us take him back to the tribe. And in that tribe, they had a 1-week ceremony and ritual of healing where everybody, the whole group was involved, and he came out of it healed. Okay. So they knew something about restoring and recovery of soul that Western practice didn't understand. Okay. And most of us don't have that kind of tribe, you know, or even close family sometimes, and we're alone in our struggles. There was a study done at Bellevue Hospital a number of years ago about who heals faster. Is there any ethnic group that heals faster? Hispanics did. Why? Because their families would flood in, and so they had support, you know. There was this emotional connectedness and concern and so forth. When I had surgery in Boston in 2004 for a pituitary tumor, Catherine Ash was there, and Catherine May, and my friend Martha Lackner, and my sister. And we had a glorious time. We did have a great time. All the nurses would flood in to watch what was going on there. You know, it was an example of a whole supportive kind of situation. Catherine read poetry, and you know, we just had a wonderful time. It was worth the operation. All right, here are some other indications of soul loss from Kay Doherty, who's a therapist. What is soul loss? And here's how she describes it. Depression, grief that doesn't pass, anxiety, inability to move forward on some issue in life, you know, being stuck. An abbot was just talking to me recently about one former monk who just can't get beyond his anger, you know. There might be some other question in life, you know, maybe a tape in you that says, I'm no good, I'll never be, you know, you learned that somehow. I'm no good, I'll never be any good, you know. There's an old book that came out in the 70s. It's kind of a pop psychology book called Taming Your Demons. And it has a picture on the front of a person with a demon on their shoulder. It's that little voice that says to you, oh, you can't do this, or, you know, you're no good, or this is beyond you, or, you know. So how do we tame those inner scripts, you know, or the inner scripts in us that emotion works in a circular way, so that, you know, I can't forgive this person. You start remembering as soon as you get up in the morning, you're brushing your teeth and remembering what that person said to you 20 years ago, that kind of thing, you know, getting stuck psychologically. And letting go is part of the great wisdom, and that's part of the hero's journey. The first step is not only exterior, but it can be interior. Letting go of convictions we have, you know, prejudices, just stuck feelings, letting it go, moving, and then moving into what might feel like uncertainty. Inability to move forward on some issue, feeling like you are not in control of your life, feeling of being incomplete. Goes on and on. Next page. Post-traumatic stress syndrome. Just feeling disconnected from life. You can't feel anything or connect. You sense you gave away a part of you to someone, your heart, your soul, and that you were not the same once they left you or died. Loss, you know, a loss. Deep grieving. I have a new book, I should bring it over. A Jungian therapist's book on grief and dealing with grieving. Wanting to return to a person or a location that seems unhealthy or unlikely or unsafe. Why do people, you know, go through 4 marriages marrying the same kind of person who's a disaster each time, you know. Something's going on there. So in what sense is soul also heart in the deepest sense? The problem is that we in the West think of the heart as a sentimental faculty, you know, and it's a lot more than sentiment. Okay. Go down towards the bottom of the page, it says, in Aristotelian philosophy, soul is the principle of vitality and movement within a thing. I remember when I had Thomistic philosophy back when I was an undergraduate, of course that was based on Aristotle. We talked about the vegetative soul, that vegetables have soul, you know. And Aristotle's view of the soul is just that what causes inward movement. It's a source of life. And my advisor at Fordham said that that could be determined by anybody who's, you know, observing life, that it's movement. But it's a lot more than that. The Aristotelian view of soul is very shallow. Raymond Moody, who is a great expert on after-death experiences, you probably know his work. I heard him interviewed on radio last year, and he said, the Aristotelian view of soul is just absolutely wrong. I sat up in bed and said, he's right. And I meant to write to him, but I never got around to it, you know. And so this deeper sense of soul as the fullness of the human person, taking on the psychological besides just, it's the spiritual essence of the person. It is, but it's more than that. Okay. All right. The last page here, second to the last page, is a quotation from the Dalai Lama. And I don't agree with it metaphysically or philosophically or theologically, and yet it's inventive. I'm just amazed that the Dalai Lama came up with this. He says, I call the high and light aspects of my being spirit, and the dark and heavy aspects soul. Soul is at home in the deep and shaded valleys. Now that's exactly what Keats and James Hillman are saying. Soul is, you know, through the mud and difficulties of life. Heavy, torpid flowers saturated with black grow there. The rivers flow like warm syrup. They empty into huge oceans of soul. Spirit is a land of high white peaks and glittering jewel-like lakes and flowers. It would be typical for a Tibetan to say that, you know, because of the mountaintops in the Himalayas. Life is sparse and sounds travel great distances. There is soul music, soul food, soul love. You know, we talk about soul mates, friends, okay? A very deep connection. Okay. People need to climb the mountain not simply because it is there, but because the soulful divinity needs to be mated with the spirit. Now, it's ironic, you see, because, you know, does God have a soul? Or isn't God total spirit? Does God have a soul? It doesn't matter. What he's saying is very important. He's saying that soulful divinity, divinity which, you know, goodness diffuses itself, and so that God, which is goodness, must overflow, like the fountain. And so you could say that there is a soul in God. There's a desire in God. Pseudo-Dionysius, I'm saying this for the theologians here, Pseudo-Dionysius says God is eros. God is eros. God is this outpouring, this outreach. And so, in a sense, God is soulful. And again, I don't want to argue about the theology or philosophy there, but there is a sense of the soul of God being mated with spirit, even human spirit. You know, that's very much the Franciscan tradition. Bonaventure and Duns Scotus and so forth. All right, one final thing about the goodness of the human person. The poem at the end, For a Child of God by Jessica Powers. this is one of my favorite poems. It's about what's the nature of the human person. You know, we can say it philosophically, and that's abstract and conceptual and dead in a way. But this is a poet trying to express it. She says, the saints and mystics had a name for that deep inwardness of flame, the height or depth or ground or goal, which is God's dwelling in the soul. Not Kapak's day, which means capacity for God. And that's a wonderful definition of the human person, our capacity for God, do you say? Nor yet scintilla anime, which means a spark of the soul. Not synderesis, which means all the faculties of the soul together. All are fair, you know, they're all saying something. But heaven, because God is there. All day and when you wake at night, think of that place of living light, yours and within you and aglow, where only God and you can go. None can assail you in that place save your own evil routing grace. Not even angels see or hear, nor the dark spirits prowling near. But there are days when watching eyes could guess that you hold paradise. Sometimes the shining overflows, and everyone around you knows. That kind of Rihanna, that kind of radiance of the spirit that flows out from deep spiritual people, you know. Dorothy Day had it, and you know, all of the figures that Paul Elie wrote about in that book, Thomas Merton, and Dorothy Day, and Walker Percy, and who else? Flannery O'Connor, you know. These are the kind of people, and then some just ordinary people that I know. Some of my wonderful older friends in Binghamton, some of you might have known Eddie Armstrong from Endwell. You know, he had a joyous radiance of the spirit almost all the time. You know, it was just a pleasure to meet him. And you know, there was a wonderful woman in Binghamton, Margaret, who was a retired teacher, and I'd meet her and she'd say, "Sister Donald, the Holy Spirit is doing such great work in you." And I thought, oh? But talk about a positive, you know, just flowing out with love and support and, you know, that kind of positive energy and so forth. So this, if the Dalai Lama could read that poem, he'd say, bravo. You know, he'd say, this is it.
Who wrote this one? Who wrote
Jessica
it?
Powers.
Jessica Powers.
Yeah, she was a Carmelite prioress. She was Sister Miriam of the Holy Spirit in the Milwaukee Carmel. But she's a wonderful, maybe one of the best religious, spiritual poets of the last century or so. Any questions or discussion?
Yes, Sister Donald, I had once read a book a long time ago by James Hillman called The Soul's Code. And he had this view that each person is a unique manifestation of sort of God's love. This is, you know, vague in my head. And that part of your job, I mean, I hate to make it a job because that sounds like trying too hard, but part of your search is to figure out what that sort of unique, and I think he mentioned trying to think back to when you were 12 years old, before adolescence, and what was it, you know, and that would be a key. Is that,
Yeah, I sort of like that book, and then I kind of agree with it. In fact, the new book by Richard Rohr, Immortal Diamond, basically endorses that. He uses a Franciscan term, haec cietas, which is Latin for the thusness, the uniqueness of each thing. But I liked Hillman's view that the soul's code is like the inherent DNA in each person, and so that there's this uniqueness, you know. And I'm an identical twin, so, you know, for the first 18 years of our life, we had the same conditioning. We were not separated for more than 1 or 2 days during that whole 18 years. And yet, I'm an identical twin, and yet my sister is much different than I am, I feel. You know, and we become more different the older we grow. And so I think we're a lot similar, too. You know, I mean, people are struck by our similarity, as Catherine would say. But there's a uniqueness in each one of us, too, you know. And I think it's the soul's code. And it's very interesting, the people that James Hillman uses in that book, The Soul's Code. One of them is Josephine Baker, which incredible. Right.
Black in Paris. And
Yeah, and I forget who else he uses in the
I
book, but it's
remember.
true. I mean, I think it's a way you can account for certain types of genius and religious expression, you know. I mean, John Wesley, for example, you know, Mother Teresa of Calcutta. There's a unique energy in them. Thomas Merton. I gave 2 talks on Thomas Merton last November in New York City for the Merton Society. Merton had a soul's code, absolutely, you know, and he called it the mystery of life within life that was unfolding. And he was always seeking this deeper mystery in his life, you know. What does God want of me right now? How is God speaking to me right now? How is the circumstances and the challenges that I have shaping the clay of my life? How is this vessel being molded? You know, how am I being stretched to grow, and so forth. And so I really do endorse that view that there is a soul's code. And so does Richard Rohr in his, you know, Immortal Diamond. You know. In my way, the Tibetans say that the essence of the person is the diamond self, the Vajra self. Okay, so the Immortal Diamond, it's a phrase from Gerard Manley Hopkins. I'll bring the quote over later this afternoon. That and Teresa of Avila, when in the interior castle, she said, I saw the center of my soul blazing up like a diamond. Why is the diamond a symbol? What is it about a diamond?
Well, when it's
The hardness,
Durable, you know, it's indestructible, okay? It's indestructible essence, you know. We would call it the indwelling trinity or the spirit, immanent spirit within the person. It's the essence of the person. And also, what creates a diamond?
a lot of flame.
Intense pressure and intense heat,
Yeah.
okay? So the intense pressures and heat of life are what form the diamond in our soul.
And yet it's full of light and sparkles
It's
and,
transparent,
yeah.
yes. And it's a symbol also for the transformation of the person and the transformation of God's intention for society, because in Revelation 21, the heavenly city, the 12-gated city, it's a mandala, 3 gates on 4 sides, 12 gates, 12-gated city. In the center is a throne, the Father with the Lamb on it, and the Spirit flowing in 4 directions. And Revelation 21 says, and I saw this river flowing from the center, crystal and diamond-like. And one of the medieval commentators, writers, says, why does he say crystal and diamond-like? Because it's indestructible, but it's transparent. Okay, so it's a very interesting symbol. Okay. Any
What
other
was the
questions?
name of that book again?
Which one?
That she was just...
James Tillman?
James Hillman, The Soul's Code. The Soul's Code. C-O-D-E.
I was going home from here the other day and listening to NPR, and they were talking about the opera that's coming. And the man said something, and it really startled me that he would say that. He said, what makes us human? It's our emotions.
Uh-huh.
I couldn't believe that, because I was brought up Aristotelian. So,
Right.
yeah, and I thought, wow, normal people are sensing this,
Uh-huh.
and that's a good thing.
Right. I heard a man being interviewed on National Public Radio Fresh Air the other day when I was driving home from Binghamton, and he has a band of some kind, and he's going on the road for a year, and he says, well, what's unique about my band is that we have a lot of soul. And he didn't mean it necessarily in the black soul sense, but in the sense of, you know, there's a depth and a passion and, you know, I forget how he put it, but he was talking about soulfulness. There's soulfulness in art, there's soulfulness in writing, there's soulfulness in living, you know. And one of the ways we can grow in soulfulness is just learning to be mindful and centered, to be in the present, power of now, as Eckhart Tolle calls it. It's a great wisdom in all the great religious traditions. So how do we grow in wideness of heart? You know, what expands our soul? There's one Islamic writer from the Middle Ages, Ibn Arabi, who says, "My soul is so large that I could be a convent of friars, and I could be, you know, I forget. I'll bring the quotation over. It's just a wonderful sense of the expansiveness of the human heart, what we can incorporate." St. Benedict, I'll end with this before we have lunch. St. Benedict had a vision before the end of his life, right before he died. He went into the tower of the monastery to pray, and there in the depth of prayer, he saw the whole world gathered before him in a sphere of light, or a ray of light. And St. Gregory the Great, who wrote the commentary, described it, said, it was not that the world grew small, but that his heart was enlarged. It was not that the world grew small, but that his heart was enlarged. So how do we enlarge our heart? You know, how do we become more inclusive? You know, the Tibetans have a form of meditation called Tonglen meditation, where you incorporate the evil.
Yeah.
You know, where you realize that the two guys in Boston who set off those bombs, you know, I have that energy in myself. I could have done that, you know. I was at a formation meeting of some Trappists and Benedictines at Spencer one time, and the Trappist novice master, well, at the meeting, the last meeting we had before the noon office, some young monk said, well, the world is so bad, you know, and he was talking about the dark side of New York City, and it's so terrible, and, you know, I'm so happy to be in a monastery and away from all of that and so forth. So I'm in the choir for noon prayer, and Father Bernard, the young novice master from Spencer, passes me and says, I could have done any of that stuff. You know, he just didn't stand off and judge, but realized that all of us have that, you know. And that maybe the violence that was perpetrated in Boston, we can look at our own violence and anger and our own demonizing of people and so forth, you know. The challenge, you know, is to find the soulfulness to bring about transformation in society.